On the dark morning of October 21st, 1941, the city of Kragujevac awoke in terror. The brutal Nazi occupation left deep scars on its inhabitants. But on this day, the horror reached a new level of cruelty. Brave young students and workers were torn from their classrooms and factories to face an unimaginable fate. The streets were stained with innocent blood in a ruthless campaign of retribution. Are you ready for what you're about to see? This is a story intertwined with remarkable sacrifice and bravery, describing how around 3,000 civilians were killed as a reprisal for the deaths of 10 German soldiers and the injury of 26 others in battles with the resistance movement. Let's get started. Serbia hardly plays a leading role in the German memory of the Second World War. However, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were stationed in the Balkans during Nazi Germany's invasion of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia between April 6, 1941 and 1945. The cemeteries, where more than 15,400 of the fallen are buried, bear witness to this. Countless graves of Serbs, Jews, and Roma bear witness to the crimes of the German occupiers. Most of them died as resistance fighters, but at least 80,000 civilians were also killed by members of the Wehrmacht and SS in a so-called atonement campaign. And if you don't know this story, be prepared to imagine one of the darkest acts ever committed by human beings. And we keep asking ourselves, how can this happen? How can there be people who are capable of such terrible acts? It's a question that I can't answer, but I will give you an idea of what they were capable of. Knowing our history makes us aware so that we do not repeat it, and that is why we must remember what happened on those dates. Already in April 1941, immediately after the attack on Yugoslavia, the German commanders ordered to take hostages from all classes of the population to prevent the formation of gangs and as a preventative protection for the troops. As punishment for every German soldier killed by the resistance fighters, 100 Serbian civilians were to be killed without further ado. For every wounded person, 50, including well-known personalities or their relatives. Can you imagine this level of evil? In the first wave, hostages were taken from the fields, from their workplaces, from the streets, and from their homes. 300 students, boys between 12 and 18 years old, were held together with their teachers in their classrooms. There were also dozens of Roma children, most of them bootblacks, who had refused to clean the boots of Wehrmacht soldiers, fearing the consequences for their families, but also because the German soldiers initially assured them that they were only checking their identity papers. Hardly anyone tried to escape. On October 20, the first 123 Serbs and Jews, including women, were shot. 10 people survived the massacre, and one of them, a man, testified to the crimes at the Nuremberg trials in 1947. Faced with certain death, the few hostages who had anything to write scrawled their last brief messages to their loved ones on scraps of paper. 42 of them have survived. Some of them read, "Mira, give the children a kiss. Children, listen to Mom. Take care, Ladza. Goodbye forever." Unbelievable, isn't it? Or, "Don't send bread tomorrow," expressing concern about wasting precious bread. Greetings to all of you from Aka. Please send my regards to my friend Danica, were the final words of Alexander, an 18-year-old high school student. But let's look at the date when this war of hate reached the next level. On the dark dawn of October 21st, 1941, the city of Kragujevac in the former Yugoslavia awoke with an eerie sense of foreboding. The air was heavy with tension, as if an ominous storm was gathering over its inhabitants. The streets, once bustling with life, were now plunged into silence and apprehension. That day, tragedy and suffering struck Kragujevac on a scale no one could have imagined. Yugoslavia had been invaded by the Axis powers in April 1941, and for months the country had suffered under German occupation. The Yugoslav population lived in a state of constant uncertainty, besieged by oppression and fear. The Yugoslav resistance had grown stronger by this time, and the partisan and Chetnik forces fought bravely to liberate their country from enemy occupation. But the German commander in Kragujevac, Lieutenant Colonel von Waldenberg, was determined to send a clear and brutal message to the population. Any act of resistance would be mercilessly punished. He had decided to carry out a ruthless campaign of reprisals to quell any hint of rebellion and to remind the people of Kragujevac that they were under the unrelenting yoke of the Third Reich. The massacre will be carried out as a retaliation for the deaths of 10 German soldiers and the injury of 26 others in a conflict with partisans and Chetniks near Kragujevac. On the morning of October 21st, 1941, German soldiers surrounded the schools of Kragujevac, where hundreds of young students were in their classrooms, eager to acquire knowledge and hoping for a better future. But what awaited them was a much darker and more terrifying fate. The doors of the schools were forced open, and the Nazis burst into the classrooms with rifles in hand. The students, confused and frightened, were separated by gender. Men and boys were forcibly dragged out of the classrooms and gathered in courtyards and squares. Mother and sisters wept desperately, trying to cling to their loved ones, as the Nazis mercilessly separated them. Fear and confusion gripped the hearts of these young students, who did not understand why they were being subjected to such horror. But schools were not the only places of horror in Kragujevac that day. Factories also became eerie scenes of suffering and death. Workers who had bravely continued to work to keep the city's economy afloat despite the occupation were torn from their jobs and thrown into the abyss of unbridled violence. The Nazis showed no mercy and made no distinction. It didn't matter whether you were a student or a worker, youth or adult, all met the same fatal fate. Mass executions were mercilessly carried out in various locations throughout the city, in schoolyards, public squares, and dark corners. Murderous bullets cut short young lives and shattered hopes. The roar of gunfire echoed in the ears of survivors, mingling with cries of agony and heartbreaking weeping. The ground in Kragujevac was soaked with innocent blood. Mothers, wives, and daughters wept in despair, clutching the faded photographs of those who could never return. At 7 a.m. on Tuesday, October 21st, 1941, Wehrmacht soldiers began lining up the hostages in groups and shooting them. By 2 p.m., it was all over. Over 2,264 people were killed. About 200 hostages had to be buried, which took days. The rest of the hostages were allowed to go home. At the same time, Wehrmacht soldiers and members of Serbian unions cooperating with the occupiers killed 1,700 civilians in Kragujevac, 50 kilometers away. The exact number of victims is difficult to determine, but it's estimated that about 2,800 people lost their lives on that tragic day in Kragujevac. Students, teachers, factory workers, and other innocent civilians became victims of the ruthless brutality of the Nazi regime. During those days, incredible examples of courage and heroism were displayed. There were many individuals who could be released but willingly faced the firing squad, refusing to abandon their comrades and friends. "Go ahead and shoot," said an elderly teacher. "I'm conducting my class." Even one German soldier was shot for refusing to participate in the killings. When a priest was offered the chance to save himself, one of the collaborators of the occupiers told him that his life was now in his hands, and that he must beg for it if he wanted to live. The priest replied, "If my life is in your hands, then I don't need it." The director of Kragujevac Gymnasium was granted exemption, but upon learning that the students wouldn't be released with him, he refused the opportunity to save himself and went to his death alongside his students. The suffering of that day left an indelible mark on the fabric of Kragujevac. The city was plunged into mourning and desolation. The shattered lives and shattered dreams left a deep wound in the hearts of every person who witnessed or heard the horrors of that fateful day. The campaign of reconciliation in Kragujevac became a symbol of human suffering during World War II. It was a reminder of the inhuman atrocities committed in the name of war and of the ruthless power of the invaders. Today, the story of that dark day in Kragujevac reminds us of the fragility of peace and the importance of fighting injustice and oppression. Today, it is important to remember those who lost their lives in the campaign of atonement in Kragujevac. Their names and stories are engraved in the collective consciousness of humanity. Have you ever heard this story? Probably not. And in fact, We humans are called short memories for repeating these mistakes from time to time and not learning about these wars. But the important thing here is to know what you think about it. Another fact is that shortly after his arrival, Böhme reminded his units, composed mainly of Austrians, of the fight against Serbia in the First World War. You are avenging your dead comrades, whose blood ran here in 1914 because of the mean Serbs. Can you imagine that? Carrying the memory of a lost war around with you and using it as a reminder to keep a just cause for your actions. Today, hardly anyone is aware of the crimes committed by imperial units in Serbia during the First World War. There was a Serb hanging from every lamppost and tree, and yet they lost the war. And for Böhme and other former Austrian officers, this defeat would have been a trauma, and they thought that it had to be corrected in some way. And somehow, however sad or cruel, they did their job. The suffering of the people who lived through this tragic event is a wound that cannot be forgotten or ignored. May the story of Kragujevac teach us to be guardians of memory so that future generations will never forget the human cost of violence and the importance of building a more humane and compassionate world. What do you think about the motives that led to this massacre?